In this video, I want to talk about validation and problem solving. And when we meet together, we're actually going to look at a particular problem and work through it together. This is probably one of the most straightforward lessons in NT104, but it's probably also one of the more crucial lessons in NT104. Essentially, everything that we're doing throughout the semester is validation and problem solving. And it's pretty straightforward once you kind of look through the process. But a lot of times students, when we come to the text, we don't necessarily see problems. And I think that's probably one of the most crucial aspects of this process is actually surfacing problems within the text and thinking about problems within the text. And the reason for this is because when we come to the text, we generally kind of have a preconceived idea about what it means, where our view of the text is somewhat limited. We've been taught that this is what this text means, or we just kind of naturally read it and don't think about contrary ways of reading it. But when we engage others who read the text differently than us, then we start to see where contrasting perspectives or contrasting points of view or different ways of understanding a particular verb or construction kind of come into play. And we start to dialogue about which way to read it. And in the most friendly way, you could say, oh, you understood that text this way? This is how it struck me. And you start to understand, you start to dialogue, what's the best way to read it? Well, I think this is probably the best way to read it because of these reasons. And so that's our validation. And so again, just in short, I think probably the most crucial aspect of this process, the validation and problem-solving process, is learning to surface some of the problems. And we'll talk about how to do that in this video. A good definition of validation comes from NT 155, and it reads, the part of the process of exegesis that evaluates various points of view in order to arrive at the most probable meaning of the subject under investigation. And so, in other words, it basically means text-based reasons derived from the text itself that support the view that you take. And so just to kind of sum this up, there's really two parts that we're really doing. The first part is that we're looking for various points of view. We're trying to surface different points of view, different ways of understanding particular problems within the text. And then the second part is that we're evaluating these different points of views. And so essentially what we're doing is we're coming up with list of pros and cons for each view to evaluate each view to arrive at the best view of the problem that we're dealing with. This really involves approaching it as a science. And what we mean by this as a science, just like what we did when we looked at textual criticism, is there's a set process of principles or method to follow. So we're going to walk through that method of how to look at commentaries, how to look at different translations, but it's also an art. And what we mean by that is that you kind of have to evaluate or weigh the evidence. You can't just stack up pros and cons and say, well, there's more pros than cons in this view, so this view's right. We kind of have to weigh each piece of evidence to kind of see how it fits together, how the evidence fits together. And then also it comes from the text. And so what we're looking at when we do validation, or we're looking for observations or evidence that comes from the text itself. We're not just listing names of scholars or commentators who agree with a particular view. And so if you were to solve a problem for me and you were to say, well, most commentators take this view, that's not really the evidence that we're looking for. We're looking for the reasons why most scholars take a particular view. There might be a particular view that most scholars take, but then when you look at the minority view, you might see that the reasons for the minority view are more compelling And so when we look for validation, we're looking for observations that come from the text itself, not just scholars and commentators. And we'll talk more about commentators here in a little bit. But here, I just want to stress the importance of primary versus secondary evidence. And so primary evidence is going to come from the text itself. Secondary evidence is whatever someone else says about the text. And so that could be a commentator, that could be BDAG, that could be Wallace. And so we're going to use secondary evidence to kind of help us understand the primary evidence. But when we list the evidence for a particular view or against a particular view, we're going to do that primarily from primary evidence. We're going to think about it from the primary evidence. So the process is first we're going to surface issues, and so we're going to identify problems. And part of this identifying problems or surfacing the issues is we're wanting to see what's at stake. And so there might be two ways of interpreting a participle. We might come across an adverbial participle, and it could be, we could take it as means, we could take it as manner, but there's not a whole lot at stake on that issue. Whereas we might look at another problem and the identity of the referent might be in question. And so one referent might be God and the other referent might be the believer. And so depending on how you take the referent, the understanding or the exegesis of the passage might turn pretty significantly. And so when we surface the issue, one of the things that we want to do when we surface the issue is articulate what's at stake with the problem. If we take view 1, this will be what's at stake. This is what that text will mean. If we take view 2, this is what the text means. And so we want to surface the problem. The second thing that we want to do, and this is probably the most important part of the process, is to solve the problem. And so we want to look for appropriate support. And this is really the validation. This is the validation step. And so essentially what we're doing when we solve the problem is we're looking for pros and cons for each view. And here the resources are endless. Most of the time you're going to be relying on commentaries to kind of surface the pros and cons for each view, but that's not limited to commentaries. You'll look at BDAG, you'll look at the grammars, you'll look at journal articles, really anywhere you can to kind of surface the pros and cons for each view. And then lastly, we want to synthesize by comparing or correlating the problem that you have in a particular text with other New Testament texts. So that's really the issue that we're doing. Now our first part, surfacing the issue, how to find problems. There's a number of different ways that you can surface the issue. The first way to surface the issue is just to compare some good English translations. And so the RSV, the NRSV, the NAB, the REB, the NASB. What's not listed here is the Holman Christian Bible and the Christian Standard Bible, and the NIV, the NLT, and the NET. Now, what's interesting about English translations, particularly translations like the RSV and the NRSV, those are pretty close translations, a lot of overlap between the translation committee. So when there's a difference in translation between the RSV and the NRSV, there it's pretty significant. There's an issue there where the committee really debated. Also between the NASB, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and the Christian Standard Bible, whenever you see a difference between the NASB and the Christian Standard Bible, that's pretty significant because these are generally your Southern Baptist, Broadman Holman publisher type translation. And so if there's a difference between the NASB and the CSB, for example, pretty significant. If you can get your hands on a good 1984 NIV and compare it to the most recent NIV, and there's a change, That's pretty significant. And you can also find this on the web if you just search for changes in the NIV. There's websites that will highlight where the more recent NIV has updated or changed the 1984. And then the NLT, the New Living Translation, is a really kind of good translation to kind of read and to compare with these other translations to kind of see how they're translating the text a little differently. And then the Net Bible is unique because unlike these other translations, the Net Bible has pretty extensive study notes. And so if you just look at the footnotes, you'll see where the translator had really kind of debated on translating a clause or a phrase one way or over another. And so looking at the footnotes in the Net Bible might surface some problems. The second way to kind of surface a problem is to look at commentaries. And this is where you're going to want to look at several different commentaries on a particular passage. And you're not going to want to read the entire commentary. You're looking for the one paragraph in that commentary that deals with the particular phrase or the particular word that you're dealing with. And there might be a paragraph or two. It's probably no longer than a page. And so this is where you want access to as many commentaries. And so it kind of feels like you're reading a lot, but you're not really. You're reading about a page out of as many commentaries as you can get your hands on. So maybe 5 or 6 different commentaries. And so the question came up, you're requiring us to buy at least one commentary, but we need to have access to all these other commentaries. Well, this is why. Because each commentary is going to read that particular word or phrase that we're dealing with from a different perspective. And so we want to see how they're reading it and get their pros and cons for why they're taking it one way over another. And so that's how we're going to use the commentary literature. So we need access to as many different commentaries as we can get our hands on. Generally, you could look up key periodical articles. You're going to get these periodical articles out of the commentaries themselves. If you wanted to be a purist and do pure research, you could probably go to a journal article database like ATLA or JSTOR and type out or do a search on your individual passage that you're looking for. So the problem that you're going to work on in Ephesians 2:14, you could go to ATLA, for example, and search on every article that refers to Ephesians 2:14 and kind of skim through the journal articles. Probably a better way of doing that is after you've consulted 2 or 3 different commentaries and you see maybe 2 or 3 different articles surface out of all of those commentaries. Those are probably going to be the key articles that you need to pay attention to. But you also have to pay attention to the publication dates as well. So if you're looking at an older commentary, you're going to miss any kind of periodical article that was written after its publication. And then lastly, just read the passage. And you guys have been introduced to Greek enough to start to ask, what type of participle is this? Is there a number of different ways that we could parse it? How would I diagram it? What does it look like on the structural layout? And so kind of going through that process, you'll start to see, okay, there might be 2 or 3 different ways to understand this passage. And then just simply discussing it with others. And so I know that's difficult now, but just taking some time and talking to others, reading the text with others to kind of see how they are understanding a particular text is pretty key as well. So when we're solving the problem, which is our second step, we've surfaced the problem, now we want to solve the problem. Really what we want to do is we want to define the problem and identify what type of problem it is. We could be dealing with a lexical issue, and so a particular word might mean one thing or the other. And so the best way to solve the problem might be to do a word study. There might be some type of grammatical problem. So does a phrase modify a particular verb, or does it modify the verb after it? And so, so there might be some question about how the passage fits together. There might be an identity problem, and so it might be an issue of a referent, and that's the kind of problem that you're going to be tackling with in Ephesians 2:14. And so you got to identify what type of problem you're dealing with, because once you define the problem that you're dealing with, that'll start to kind of help you think through how to solve the problem, what tools you'll need to solve the problem. The other thing, and this is probably the most important, is to determine what's at stake. And so why is it important to solve this problem for the exegesis of the passage? And so you really need to kind of think through what's at stake with the problem. And then we want to break down the problem into different views. And this is where you're probably going to use commentaries to kind of surface different ways of approaching the problem or different solutions to the problem. And as you do this, you want to come up with reasons for each option. And then finally, you want to evaluate the reasons with appropriate tools. And so it may, one piece of evidence may not be as weighty as another piece of evidence. You also want to evaluate the reasoning of the tools as well, especially if the tools disagree. And so there might be an issue where two commentaries disagree with one another. Well, there might be, some type of bias that one commentary has, or they might have a kind of a theological axe that they need to grind. And so you kind of have to account for that as well. And then finally, once you've listed out all the options and all the reasons for those options, or the pros and cons for each option, you just need to make a choice. And I tend to think in terms of a grade. And so you might say, here's 3 options to this problem: view 1, view 2, view 3. I opt for view 3. I'm going to give it a C, which means I could go either way between view 1 and view 3, but I'm going to side with view 3 kind of by a hair. You might say view 1, view 2, view 3. I go with view 3 with an A, which means there's not a whole lot that's going to change my mind on this, and so it's pretty confirmed. And so making a choice is going to be pretty important. And that's difficult for some students as well. Some of the tools that we'll use, particularly if the problem is lexical, again, like I said, we would use the same kind of tools that you would use for a word study. So BDAG, you might use Lohannida, you might use LSJ. You'll also need a concordance, and so you can do a word search in Logos to kind of see how the word is used. And again, we're thinking in terms of our basic lexical word study type approach. So looking, if we're dealing with a problem in Ephesians, looking in the near context, looking in the wider context of Ephesians, looking within Paul, then looking within the New Testament outside of Paul. And so note the useful information these basic tools give you, and so kind of think through it. And then also some other lexical tools, TD&T, NIDNIT, and ED&T. These might be helpful as well. And then there's some other tools like periodical articles or even books. We have an entire book. I have an entire book behind me written by N.T. Wright on justification. And so if you're doing a problem that deals with the Dikao word group, you might want to consult what N.T. Wright has to say or John Piper has to say, contrary to N.T. Wright. For grammatical issues, make liberal use of Greek grammars, and so Wallace, you all have Wallace and BDF. Make sure you use the index. Some other grammars, J.A.T. Robertson's grammar, Nigel Turner's syntax, and so there's a number, Moulton's idiom book. And so each of these grammars are going to have an index that you can use. And so, for example, you might want to peruse each of those indexes for Ephesians 2:14 to see if they have anything to say about our problem and help you to identify the problem. And I'll just give you a little hint on Ephesians 2:14. There is a little bit of a grammatical issue in verses 14 and 15 that might help you as you're dealing with the identity of the Tom Mesetoiken Ton Frogmu. And so even though it's a referential issue, there's a little bit of a grammar issue there that might help you solve it. Getting organized. Basically what you want to do is gather information from the text itself. And what we would recommend is that you basically put on an individual page a view. And so if you have a problem with the text and there are 3 different views, you would have 3 different pieces of paper. Or if you use a computer, maybe, I use Google Keep, so you might have one problem in one file. And the nice thing about something like Evernote or Google Keep or OneNote is that it automatically backs up. And so look at the text itself and kind of think through the various ways that a particular text could be used. But then you're also going to want to look at the tools. And when you deal with the tools are going to lead you into textual evidence. And so we're not looking at the tools or the commentaries or the lexicons to say, well, this is the BDAG view. What we're doing is we're using BDAG to lead us back to the primary evidence. And so good commentary is going to give you their validation for their view. That's what we're interested in. And also a good commentary is going to give you multiple points of view. So if you're looking at a particular text and you wonder, gosh, there's 2 ways to understand this phrase, let me pull out a good commentary to see what they have to say about it. You might read that commentary and find out that there's a 3rd view. And then, okay, there's a 3rd view. Let me look at another commentary to see what they have to say. Well, you might read that commentary and find out that there's a 4th view. And so these commentaries, they're going to give you various points of view or various solutions to your problem, but they're also going to bring you back to the text to kind of give you the primary evidence that you need to solve the problem. Again, just a list of tools for the particular problem that you're dealing with. If we're dealing with a TC problem, the most important tool is going to be your Metzger's commentary, textual commentary in the Greek New Testament. If you're dealing with a lexical problem, I would look at BDAG as a minimum. Probably do a word search in Logos to kind of see how the word is used within Paul or in Ephesians. If you're dealing with a grammatical issue, I would at least look at Wallace's text. Probably go a little further abroad than just Wallace. You might look at Robertson or BDF. If it's a theological issue, I would recommend Zook and Bach, Biblical Theology of the New Testament. There's also a number of really good biblical theologies in the Zondervan series. Also, a lot of more recent commentaries will add short theological sections at the end of the section that they're dealing with. If it's a referential issue, I would recommend looking at Keener's IVP commentary, background commentary to the New Testament. And so that's going to be really helpful. And then commentaries. Look for the best technical exegetical commentary on the book. A lot of the applicational commentaries like the NIV application or even the Story of God biblical commentary, they're going to emphasize application, which is good, but what we want are we want the maximum amount of views on a particular problem. And so when it comes to exegesis, these application commentaries are going to maybe boil down a problem to, well, this is the most important problem, and even though there's 4 views, we could boil it down to 2 views. And so we want all four views. And also, our applicational commentators are going to give you maybe the top reason for, or the top two reasons for the view that they like. They're not going to be as thorough as some of our technical exegetical commentaries will be. So make sure that you're using the right tools in the right way when you work through a problem. Just some other things to be mindful of. Watch out for the date. And so if a commentary was written before 1900 versus after 1900, that might be important. Sometimes the older commentaries, particularly the older ICC commentaries, are pretty good with grammar. And so a lot of the commentators are classicists, so they really know Greek very well. Probably better than some of our more recent commentators. Note the emphasis of the commentary, and so one commentary might be more mindful of the background issues, whereas another commentary might be more literary. And then note the audience, the intended audience of a commentary. So, like I said, each commentary has its place within its audience. Just be mindful of it. So, not every commentary is going to be a technical, critical commentary. But that doesn't mean that all devotional commentaries are bad. You might actually have some good exegetical insight in a devotional commentary. And so some important commentators by, like, say, John Stott, actually has some interesting insight into some problems, and they boil it down pretty helpfully as well. Some other comments: authors differ in style, and so you just kind of have to wrestle with each commentary. Question: which one helps you the most? And so, which commentator is going to wrestle with the particular issues that you have? That's probably going to be the one that's going to help you the most. Those that wrestle with the exegetical issues and give you options, that's what you want to look for. It's not necessarily the one that gives you the right view or the view that you agree with, but you want the one that says, hey, there's 10 possible solutions to this problem. And so they're wrestling through each solution. Those that trace the argument flow and explain the message of the text, I think that's really helpful. And this is really key. I probably should have started with this, but I will tell you, and it's implicit in the video that I've made so far, that we're looking for text-centered evidence. Generally, the solution to any problem fits within the message of the text. And so if you understand the message of Ephesians, for example, the solution of any problem in Ephesians usually coheres with that overarching message of the book. And so if you can understand the argument flow of the book, that usually solves a lot of your problems. And then again, note older commentaries, and those are commentaries before 1950, are really, like I said, they're probably a little bit better on the grammar, but in terms of lexical issues or maybe referential or background issues, they're lacking. There's been a lot of archaeology that's been done. Probably the most important archaeological find in the 40s is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so these commentaries that were written before 1950, which you'll find in Google Books, in public domain, these commentaries aren't wrestling with those issues. So be careful as you're dealing with these older commentaries. Just a few comments about the type of evidence that we're looking for. And so again, we're looking for text-based evidence. So we want to look for passages that might support the point at issue. And so there might be a particular phrase that Paul uses in a different book or elsewhere in Ephesians that might help us. And so we want to look for particular passages or parallel passages that kind of help us solve the evidence. Also, we want to look for facts and also distinguish them from the arguments that various interpreters make. And so we want to be careful that we don't just bring in their interpretation. And this is where good BE 101, distinguishing observation from interpretation on the part of our interpreters, might come in handy. And so when you read a commentator, he's going to give you a list of facts, but he's also going to interpret those facts. And so just stick with the facts. And then thirdly, I would assess the logic of each perspective. So you might read a commentator and they might be putting too much weight on a piece of evidence. And so you just want to be careful and assess the type of evidence that they're making. And then also pay attention to the context. And so is the argument that the commentator is making, is he making sense of the larger context in which the issue is being laid out? Here are 8 questions, 8 key questions to kind of ask yourself. And again, this gets back to the method of doing validation. And so just kind of thinking through each of these. What are the tools' reasons from the text? Are they theological? Are they logical? Was the evidence fully considered? And after you've read 3 or 4 commentaries on a particular problem, you'll see, well, commentary 1 really doesn't deal with a lot of the evidence that commentary 3 dealt with. And so was the evidence fully considered? And after you've read 2 or 3 different commentaries or 4 or 5 commentaries, you'll start to get the scope of the issue and the scope of the evidence as well. Thirdly, do conclusions follow from the evidence? So are there other conclusions more probable based on the same evidence? And so when you're reading these commentaries, are they weighing the evidence appropriately? Fourth, is the evidence historically sensitive? And this is going to be pretty key, particularly with those older commentaries that might be giving us a little bit of a dated information. 5, am I aware of the arguments for and against the various options? And so can you articulate the options? Can you articulate the reasons why for each of those options? And if you can do that, that's going to be pretty key. You're going to have a pretty good handle on your paper. You're going to be able to write a strong, concise paper. 6, do I understand clearly the views I'm rejecting? And this is where you need to be careful about a straw man. And so you don't want to put up a view that really doesn't hold merit and not articulate it well just to dismiss it. And this is where when you're presenting views in your paper, I usually tell students, if at all possible, try to present the view from a positive perspective. And what that means is if you're presenting a view of particularly a view that you don't agree with, try to present it from the commentators who hold to that view. So you're giving that view that you're rejecting a fair representation, and you just want to avoid straw men. 7, does the choice I've adopted make sense of the contextual and make theological sense? And so does it fit within the larger scope of the book? And that's a point that I made earlier. Most of the time, the most obvious solutions to any problem are going to make sense of the overall message of the book. And then 8, is the problem either or both and? And so when we look at a number of issues, are they mutually exclusive? Can 2 or 3 of the views be collapsed into one kind of larger view, and really the difference between these 2 or 3 views is emphasis? Or is it truly an either or, kind of a mutually exclusive idea? And then just a number of guidelines when you're writing your validation paper. Don't merely cite a scholar's name for support. So just to say that Wallace holds this view, that's not evidence. We want to focus on the textual evidence that Wallace gives us. Cite specific, valid reasons for your view. I would probably even be terse and say option one or view one states X. There's three reasons why. First, second, third, or maybe one period, two period, three period. Be very clear when you're listing out your validation. I would prioritize your best reasons for your view, and so put your best reason for view one in number one, and then kind of work down from there. Cite specifics from the context, and so make sure that you're paying attention to both the near context and the far context, and give the significance of the choice of your argument. That's probably going to be in the introduction, and so what's at stake for the problem, and then in the conclusion, you'll kind of round that out as well. You kind of want to highlight the issue and highlight your solution to it as well, and how it impacts the text. And then lastly, we want synthesis and correlation. And so exegete, but then correlate more broadly within the New Testament. And so we want to examine and consider other parallels. The problem that you're going to wrestle with in Ephesians 2:14, that's going to be difficult because this is really the only place that this phrase is used. There might be some other identifications in the gospel where you might be able to kind of think through some correlation there, but this is going to be difficult in terms of parallel passages or parallel statements. Correlation can qualify exegetical results, providing perspective and balance, and that's really kind of what you want when you're thinking through the problem. Lastly, I just want to say, in terms of the value of validation, it's one of the keys to good exegesis. And so, if you've got validation, or if you've validated your understanding, that means that you've thought through the issue, and you're pretty sure about where you stand. And so, when you read a text and you interpret a text or exegete a text, you know there's other options, and the option that you've chosen is on good, solid validation. Secondly, it's based on the text itself and not on slogans. And so we're not trying to prop up some theology, we're trying to understand the text. And I think anything that's going to draw you back to the text, to read the text more closely, is going to be helpful in the long run. Third, it's committed to following where the text leads. And so don't be afraid of interpreting the text. Don't put your theology above the text. Let the text lead you to theology, and you won't go far afield. Don't be afraid of that. Fourth, it consists not in setting forth what is merely possible, but what is most probable in a given context. So when you do this process, you're gonna find a lot of possibilities, but that doesn't mean that every possibility is probable. And then last, it's the foundation behind good teaching and preaching. And we have here the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule is basically 80% of what you study is going to end up be about 20% of what you teach or preach. And it might actually be 90-10 or 95-5, depending on how much work you put into a sermon or a lesson. But the point is, even though the people in the audience are getting 20% of what you've prepared, you're sure of what you're giving them. And also, after you teach or preach, you're going to have several people come up to you and say, "Have you considered the problem in this passage?" And you can say, "Yeah, I have. And this is where I've landed, and this is why." And so, good validation is really going to help your teaching and preaching, even if it doesn't come out in what you say from the pulpit. And then finally, what I would say is rate your decisions. We've talked about this already. If you give it an A, absolutely certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I'm not changing my mind. If you give it a B, this is probably right beyond a reasonable doubt. If you give it a C, when we get to heaven, you might be right, but I have some doubt. And then if you give it a D, flip a coin, neither of us really knows. There's no clear or convincing choice. And the longer you do this, you might find that you have what I call reverse grade inflation. And so I know when I was younger and I was doing this, everything was an A or a B. And now I find that everything is a B and a C, and I have more D's than I ever had before. And so the more you do this, the more credence you give to other positions. But essentially, that's it. That's the validation process in a nutshell. Essentially, what you want to do is you want to surface any kind of problem. The way you surface the problem is by looking at good translations, seeing where the translations differ, looking at good commentaries, seeing where how they surface the problem or how they read a text, talking to others. You want to see what's at stake with the problem. Is this a big issue? Is this going to change the way that I read a particular passage or this phrase? You want to surface all the possible solutions and suss out the pros and cons for each solution, and then give a good strong conclusion to the problem. Don't just say here's a problem, here's some solutions, but come to some conclusion with some conviction on on what the answer might be.